Okay, so welcome to section 5.4, the product to sum identities. Okay, so first let's recall the sum and difference formulas for sine and cosine. So remember, cosine of a sum, alpha plus beta, is two terms, namely cosine alpha, cosine beta, and then minus sine alpha, sine beta, because the signs differ for cosine, whereas cosine of a difference, alpha minus beta, is cosine alpha, cosine beta, and then plus sine alpha, sine beta, because the SIG ends change signs, right? Let me write beta a bit better, beta. And we had that sine of alpha plus beta was sine of the first, sine alpha, cosine of the second, beta, then plus sine of the second, sine beta, cosine alpha, or vice versa. I could technically do cosine alpha, sine beta. Let's see if that'll work better for this derivation. Cosine alpha, sine beta. Tomato, tomato. So then we have sine of a difference. Alpha minus beta will be sine alpha, cosine beta. And then minus cosine alpha, sine beta. Okay, so now let's consider the following. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the cosines. So let me rewrite them. Yeah, I'll keep the color orange. So cosine of alpha plus beta is equal to cosine of alpha times cosine of beta minus sine of alpha times sine of beta. And what I'd first like to do is I'd like to add to that cosine of a difference. So cosine of alpha minus beta, which is cosine alpha, cosine beta, plus sine alpha, sine beta. So if I add these two together, what happens is that the sine terms reduce. And so I have on the left-hand side that cosine of alpha plus beta plus cosine of alpha minus beta will be equal to, well, how many cosine alpha, cosine betas do I have? If I add these two together, well, it looks like I have two of them. So 2 times cosine of alpha times cosine of beta. So solving for cosine alpha, cosine beta, that means that cosine of alpha times cosine of beta, I would just need to divide both sides by 2. So it should be 1/2 the quantity. Cosine of alpha plus beta plus cosine of alpha minus beta. Okay. So once again, let me do it a bit darker. So let's start with cosine of alpha plus beta, which we know is cosine alpha times cosine beta minus sine of alpha times sine of beta. And actually, while I'm thinking about it, let me put a box around this so I can refer back to it later. Okay, so where was I? Okay, now we have cosine of alpha minus beta will be cosine of alpha, cosine of beta, plus sine of alpha times sine of beta. And now what I'd like to do is I'd like to subtract, take the difference of these two. Okay, so notice if I take the difference, these sum to 0. So on the left-hand side, I will have cosine of alpha plus beta minus cosine of alpha minus beta is equal to, looks like I will have, if this is a negative sign here, I'll have negative 2 sine alpha times sine beta. So in this case, I'd like to divide by a negative 2. So this would imply that if I solve for sine of alpha times sine of beta, it's going to be negative 1/2 the quantity cosine of alpha plus beta minus cosine of alpha minus beta. Just divide both sides by a negative 2. So let me put a box around this one. Okay, so this deals with the two formulas involving cosine. So now let's deal with sine. Pardon me. Okay, so what colors should I use for sine? Let's do, how about this red? So what do I know about sine of a sum? So we have sine of a sum, alpha plus beta, is sine of the first, alpha, times cosine of the second, beta, plus cosine of the first, alpha, times sine of the second, beta. Whereas sine of a difference, alpha minus beta, will be sine of the first, alpha, times cosine of the second, beta, minus cosine of the first, alpha, times sine of the second, beta. And I would like to take the sum first for these guys. Okay, so adding, I see that these last two terms will sum to 0. So on the left, I will have the sine of alpha plus beta, to which I'm adding sine of alpha minus beta. And that will be equal to, how many sine alpha, sine betas do I have here? Sorry, sine alpha, cosine betas. It looks like I have 2 of them. So I have 2 sine alpha, cosine beta. So if I want to isolate, sine alpha times cosine of beta, I would divide both sides by 2. So I'll get 1/2 the quantity sine of alpha plus beta plus sine of alpha minus beta. Boy, my writing's getting worse. Okay, so let me put a box around this for the time being, because I will refer back to it. Oh boy, okay, let me try and put a box around here. Kind of. Okay, now let's continue with sine, but I'll take the difference of the two now. So now we have sine of alpha plus beta, which we know is sine of the first, alpha, times cosine of the second, beta, plus cosine of the first, alpha, times sine of the second, beta. And sine of alpha minus beta, that difference will be sine of the first, alpha, times cosine of the second, beta, minus cosine of the first, alpha, times sine of the second, beta. And in this case, I'm taking the difference. So I notice that if I subtract the first terms on the right, sum to 0. So I'll have sine of the quantity, alpha plus beta, from which I'm subtracting sine of the quantity, alpha minus beta. And what that gives me is a double negative, so I have positive 2 cosine alphas, sine betas. So if I want to isolate for cosine alpha times sine of beta, I just divide both sides of this equation by 2. So I get 1/2 the quantity sine of alpha plus beta minus sine of alpha minus beta. And then we go ahead and put a box around this. Okay, so what it looks like is I have 4 product to sum identities. So let me go ahead and write the product to sum identities. Product to sum identities. Hopefully I have enough room for all 4. Oops, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the first one will be, well, the first one is cosine alpha, cosine beta. Okay, so cosine of alpha times cosine of beta, we found to be 1/2 the quantity What was that quantity? What was cosine of alpha plus beta plus cosine of alpha minus beta? So it involves just cosines. So cosine of alpha plus beta plus cosine of alpha minus beta. The second identity was, well, sine of alpha, sine of beta, and that was minus 1/2, the difference. Okay, so sine of alpha, sine of beta was a negative 1/2, the difference between the cosines, namely cosine of alpha plus beta minus cosine of alpha minus beta. Okay, let me get a little bit darker purple. For the next two, we had combined sine and cosine. So the next one will be sine alpha, cosine beta, which is 1/2 the sum of the sines. So we have, what was it again? Sine of alpha, sine of the first, sine of alpha, cosine of beta, and that was 1/2 the sum of the two sines. So that is sine of alpha plus beta plus sine of alpha minus beta. And finally, if I have a cosine of alpha times sine of beta, that yielded 1/2 the quantity, sine of alpha plus beta minus sine of alpha minus beta. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense so far, but we're still needing to derive things. So I think, can I give you examples yet? Yes, let's do examples. Okay. So for example, let's evaluate the following. Evaluate the following using the product to sum identities. Using the product to sum identities. Okay, so number one, let's say I have 12 times cosine of, let's do pi over 12, because I clearly like 12 today, times sine of 7 pi over 12. Okay, so what do we have here? We have 12 times, and let me color code this. Let's do cosine of pi over 12 times sine of 7 pi over 12. Okay, so I noticed that this is of the form cosine alpha, sine beta, so I'm going to use the last formula there on the product to sum identities. So what I'm going to get is 1/2 times, 12, momentito, 12 times, and then I'll have 1/2 the quantity, and this will be, let me do this in purple, sine of, what is the alpha and the beta? And then this will be minus sine of the alpha minus the beta. Okay, where the alpha was the argument of cosine, namely pi over 12. And the beta was the argument of sine, namely 7 pi over 12. Okay, so what do we have? Well, I know that 2 goes into 12 6 times. So once we have that, we have sine of, looks like 1 and 7 is 8 pi over 12, which of course will reduce. Then I have minus sine of 1 minus 7. Okay, that's going to be negative 6 pi over 12. And since sine is an odd function, I can factor out that negative SIGN, so this will be 6 times the quantity. Sine of 8 over 12 reduces to, well, 4 goes into 8 twice, and into 12 3 times. Factoring out the negative, this will become positive sign of 6 over 12 reduces to 1/2, so this becomes pi over 2. Okay, so we end up with 6 times the quantity. What is sine of 2 pi over 3? That is 120 degrees in quadrant 2. Well, that's positive root 3 over 2. Plus, what is sine of pi over 2, or 90 degrees? 1. So distributing the 6 inside, the first term goes to 3 root 3. The second term to 6. Okay, let's just do one more of these. This is a bit of a cumbersome section, so... Okay, where shall we go? Number 2. So let's say we have 6 times sine of 7 pi over 8 times sine of pi over 8. Actually, let me move that down a bit. Okay, so this is sine alpha, sine beta. So that's the second identity, which has a negative 1/2 in front and is the difference of cosines. Okay. So what does this give us? We have 6 times sine of 7 pi over 8 times sine of pi over 8. And we said that that will give us, so we have 6 times negative 1/2, the quantity of the difference of cosines. So it will be cosine of the sum minus cosine of the difference, where alpha, the first angle, is 7 pi over 8, and beta, the second angle, is pi over 8. Okay, so what do we get? So 6 divided by negative 2 gives us negative 3. And inside the brackets, what do we have? 7 plus 1 is 8 pi over 8. So this is 8 pi over 8. We'll reduce in the second step. And then minus cosine of, well, 7 minus 1 is going to be 6 pi over 8. Okay, so we have negative 3 times the quantity cosine of, well, 8 pi over 8 reduces to pi, from which we're subtracting. Cosine of, well, 6 over 8. 2 goes into 6 3 times, and 2 goes into 8 4 times. So we have negative 3 times the quantity. Cosine of pi is negative 1, minus cosine of 3 pi over 4. That's a 45-degree reference angle in quadrant 2, so it'll be a negative root 2 over 2, making that second term positive. And distributing, we'll have positive 3 minus 3 root 2 over 2. Okay, and there we are for this part of 5.4.